Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 10 Part 2. I'm now going to get straight back into it with the installation of the radiators, fans and dust filters. So I'm installing 4 480mm Black Ice SR1s and 20 Noise Blocker Black Silent Pro PL2s, 16 as radiator fans and 4 as case fans. Now, it doesn't matter what radiators you are using, it's extremely important that you flush them before using them. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, a simple but effective method for flushing radiators is to fill them with water, shake it up and empty it out, and continue doing this until the water coming out is perfectly clean. If you're fussy about using tap water in your radiators, you can use distilled or deionized water for the last few flushes. I've now installed the first 2 sets of radiators, fans and dust filters on this side of the build. I'm going to connect all 16 of the radiator fans to an Aquero 5 Pro. I've had a lot of questions about the Aquero 5 Pro also when I've used it in previous builds. So in this build log I'm going to cover exactly how I'm going to configure it, how I'm connecting the fans to it, how I set up the fan profiles, everything. Now I'm using Mod My Toys splitter PCBs for the radiator fans. I have 1 per radiator, so there'll be 4 fans connected to each splitter PCB. I've now installed the rest of the radiators, fans and dust filters. I've also installed the other 2 Mod My Toys splitter PCBs. You can see around this side of the build I had to install them at the front of the radiators. This is because there is less room on this side of the Case Labs Magnum TH10. So they're going to be in view around this side of the build, but it doesn't matter because they're going to be extremely clean, and this is around the back of the build. I've installed a fan and dust filter on the front of the hard drive cage. I'm going to cover the thermal design later in the build log, but as always I'm working with convection and I'm going to have positive pressure inside of the case, and all of the intakes are going to be dust filtered. So the fans on the bottom 2 radiators are drawing air in, the fans on the top 2 radiators are exhausting. Looking underneath the build you can see all of the dust filters down here. Now these dust filters are extremely easy to clean and deal with. All you need to do is vacuum them. I've removed the motherboard tray from the build again because I'm now going to get to work on the crystal link configuration on the motherboard. I decided to swap the multi-link mini fittings that I had between the graphics card water blocks with the larger normal multi-link fittings. This is something that I often do between graphics card water blocks because it's somewhere that strength is extremely important, and I've talked about this previously, the difference between multi-link mini fittings and the normal multi-link fittings. Multi-link mini fittings show more of the acrylic tube, so it improves the aesthetics. But the normal multi-link fittings are twice the size, so there's a lot more metal around the acrylic tube. It gives a lot more strength to help hold the acrylic tube in position. There's also another O-ring, so there's less chance of it leaking. So it's something you need to think about in areas where strength is important, such as between graphics cards. I strongly recommend using the larger normal multi-link fittings. I've talked about crystal link configurations a lot in previous videos, so I'm not going to cover that in this build log. It's incredible to see how popular hard tube is becoming, in particular acrylic tube. When I built Nighthawk Client Build 5, I had never seen acrylic tube used for anything but multi-GPU water cooling configs. Bitspower was the first to release an acrylic tube system, Crystal Link, and that's what it was really specifically designed for. And I used Crystal Link between graphics cards for years, and I always wanted to use it elsewhere in water cooling loops. The only thing that was stopping me was the small diameter. I always used half-inch tube and I preferred the aesthetics of it. Between graphics cards it's a different matter because most multi-GPU water cooling systems were small diameter. There's other ways of getting around that, such as a parallel configuration like I've done here, but that's a different matter. Anyway, with Nighthawk I was really stuck. I didn't have a choice. I had to use Crystal Link or use entirely fittings because it was the first time I was building on the X79 platform and installing memory water blocks, motherboard water blocks and a CPU water block. Same config as I have here, 5 water blocks in extremely close vicinity. And you know what I'd done in the past with previous platforms and builds. I think it was my third X79 build, not long after X79 was released, was not going to work anymore. I couldn't tube up with half-inch tubes, so that's really why I did it. And I was really happy with the result, and I had people coming to me asking me how I did it, where to get the fittings from. I literally had hundreds of questions. I helped so many people with their builds over the next few months, and I started seeing more and more builds coming out with acrylic tube. Eventually it got too much, so I had to link people off to my videos where I was explaining how to do it. And I'm certainly not going to say I came up with the idea or was the first person to do it. There was probably people before me who used acrylic tube. I mean, it doesn't matter, but what I'm getting at here is that I don't think this is just a trend in water cooling that is going to come and go. I think that this is an evolution, and there's a couple of reasons I think that. One is because there's other benefits that come from using acrylic tube, not just an improvement in aesthetics, also the durability. The only reason I've ever had to do a coolant change is because of soft tubing breaking down. Soft tubing breaks down very quickly, and when it does, it leaches plasticizer, which gets carried around the loop and discolors everything, and people often blame these problems on coolant. But soft tubing, it also discolors, stains, clouds, it looks terrible, and this can happen after a very short time. And I'm thinking that all these systems being built now with acrylic tube and fittings, the coolant could last 3 to 5 years in these builds instead of 1 to 2 years. That's with high quality coolant. We don't really know yet because this is so new, but I'm looking forward to seeing these builds down the track and how much it's going to reduce maintenance with water cooling systems. And there's also something else. Primo Chill has released a new product. It's a new acrylic tube system. It comes with fittings, all different colored fittings, all different colored acrylic tube, a bending system, which is a foam insert you insert into the acrylic tube, then you can heat it and bend it without it losing shape. So usually when you bend acrylic tube without the insert, it squashes and loses shape and looks terrible. So Primo Chill has found a way around that. You can also bend it far tighter, but the best thing about this new acrylic tube system is that it's a larger diameter. It's actually half-inch OD, so this is going to look awesome. I'm really excited about using it and seeing it used, and it's something I've always wanted. As I said, since way before Nighthawk, the only reason I wasn't using acrylic tube was because of the small diameter. So it's great to see. I'll put a link in the video description to this new Primo Chill product. So I've now finished the crystal link configuration on the motherboard. I've finished tubing up all of the water blocks, and I ended up deciding to make some changes to it. I changed it around a fair bit. I had to take a specific tubing routing. It's very important. You'll see why later on. I wanted to come in on the right hand side into the bottom of the memory water block, and then I needed to go out on the left hand side from the top of the memory water block. And there's a few ways of doing that. There's a lot of different routings you can take, but this was the best one I found. You want to take the shortest possible tubing routing, and obviously the aesthetics of it is important, so you need to find a tubing routing where there's some kind of symmetry. So there's a little bit of symmetry you can see in the middle there. It's something I always try to go for. And what looked really out of place was the section of tube between the motherboard water block and the memory water block on the left hand side, because it was a big long piece of tube going up on an angle. So that's why I have those extra fittings in between there to make that tube horizontal. I have a 30mm extension fitting, a 45-degree single rotary, and a 90-degree dual rotary, and then I have the section of crystal link. So I did that to improve the aesthetics. So I'm going to build this entire loop from acrylic tube, except for some sections around the back of the build, which I'll talk about shortly. If you want to make up custom lengths of acrylic tube, you need to find a source, and it is a little bit difficult to find. What you need is 12mm OD, 10mm ID. I currently get my acrylic tube from E22. I'll put a link in the video description to their website. E22 is awesome because they make their own water cooling components. They have a lot of exclusive components and they're rapidly growing. It's a little bit of a slow process making up custom lengths of acrylic tube. The first thing you need to do is figure out your tubing routing. Then you need to get your fittings in position, and then you can take your measurements. Now when you're taking your measurements, you need to make sure that everything is square, and you need to be within 1 millimeter with your measurements, because otherwise it puts all your angles off and it's really easy to see that you've made a mistake. It doesn't really matter how you cut the acrylic tube as long as you spend a lot of time cleaning up the cuts. What I'm doing here is definitely not ideal using a jigsaw, but it certainly does the job. So you can use wet and dry sandpaper to clean up the ends of the acrylic tube. If you take a look at Bitspower Crystal Link, you'll notice that the ends are nicely rounded, and this is obviously because the acrylic tube has to fit inside O-rings, and the O-rings need to fit tightly around it, so if there's anything sharp left behind or rough surfaces, it's likely that you're going to get a leak. So make sure you don't sand past where the fitting is going to go up to. With normal multi-link fittings it's about 4 millimeters, with multi-link mini it's about 2 millimeters. Otherwise you're going to be able to see where you've been sanding. There is a way around this, and you don't have to do this, but I do recommend it. What I started with there was 400 grit sandpaper, and what I'm doing now is polishing the ends of the acrylic tube. If you're going to polish it, you need to go back to about 1500 grit. There's a lot of ways of polishing it. What I'm using here is a Dremel with a cloth polishing attachment. I'm also using some Novus acrylic polish. And if you do this, if you polish the ends, it's highly unlikely that you're going to get a leak. So this is just reducing the risk as much as possible. So I've finished another 2 sections of the loops, and now you can start to see the tubing routing that I'm taking. So from the pump and res configs, I'm going up into the water blocks, through the water blocks, then through the radiators, and then back to the pump and res configs. So the loop is starting to take shape, and I think it looks a little bit unbalanced at the moment, but once the loop is complete and the cables are in place, it's going to work nicely. The reason why I wanted, horizontal and vertical 90-degree angles, I prefer the aesthetics, but I'm also going to do that with the cables. So, the cables are going to match up with that. The 24 pin is going to be horizontal, whereas all of the PCIe are going to be vertical. So I've started installing fittings for the rest of the loops, and I'm now going to go cut some more acrylic tube and continue. Now there's actually 2 ways you can route your loop with these Bitspower pump and res configs. You can route your loop through the pump top so that the res is not part of the flow of the loop, or you can route your loop through the res. If you're going to route your loop through the res, you need to purchase these components separately. So what I have here is a Bitspower triple opening reservoir top and a Bitspower aqua pipe. I'm going to show you exactly how these need to be configured shortly. As I've mentioned previously, if you route your loop so that the res is not part of the flow of the loop, your loop will take an incredible amount of time to fill, and it will take days for the air to come out of your loop. But if you route your loop so that the res is part of the flow of the loop, your loop will be very, very quick to fill, and the air will come out of your loop in a matter of hours. I've installed the triple opening top and the aqua pipe, so this is how they need to be configured. And where the loop comes back to the top of the res, it needs to go through the aqua pipe. The purpose of the aqua pipe is to get the flow of the loop below the coolant level in the reservoir. That way there's no splashing, no noise, and there's also no air going back into the coolant. I've also drilled some holes in the case. When I made the mounting plate for the reservoirs, I decided that I was going to use the existing holes in the case to route the tubing. As I've mentioned previously in this build log, when it comes to mods, I always want to go further. I always want to go all out, but it's really not up to me. Mods take a lot of time, they cost, so I decided that I wasn't going to, go any further than the mounting plate for the reservoirs. But when it came to building the loops, it was just going to be a mess if I used the existing holes. And I decided to drill these holes. It's not something I would usually do this late in a build. I had to mask up everything so that I didn't get any iron filings anywhere. But it's all done now, and the loop is going to be a lot cleaner. I've now completed both of the water cooling loops, so both loops are ready to fill. I've gone for horizontal and vertical 90-degree angles, except on the motherboard where everything is too close together to be able to do that. I much prefer the aesthetics this way. You use a few more fittings going for horizontal and vertical 90-degree angles, but in my opinion, it's definitely worth it. I mean, it does depend on the build. Now, between the two radiators at the top and bottom of the build, I've had to do this complex fittings configuration. So what I have here is a 90-degree single rotary, 90-degree dual rotary, Bitspower acrylic 2, which is designed for multi-GPU water cooling configs. It's a telescopic fitting, and I have the same thing on the other side, so a 90-degree dual and a 90-degree single. I've had to do this because the holes in the dividing panel of the Case Labs Magnum TH10 are in the wrong place. They don't actually line up with the inlet and outlet on pretty much any radiator, so they really need to be expanded or moved so that you can just run tubing straight through there without a problem. I mean, if you're using soft tubing, you can bend it through those holes, but it is very, very difficult. So I decided to make a feature out of the drainage systems. This is not something I normally do. Usually I try to hide them, but this was also a perfect position for them. From here, they are going to immediately drain the reservoirs and most of the loops. There wasn't a better spot for them anywhere in the loops. So what I have here is a Bitspower rotary T-fitting, mini D-plug, and Bitspower tap. All you need to do to use the drainage systems is connect up a 90-degree fitting and some tubing. So at the top here, I have a Bitspower panel fitting, an extension fitting, a 90-degree dual rotary, and some acrylic tube. And I was thinking about putting fill ports in the top of the case, but it is going to be very easy to fill the reservoirs from this point. So I bet a lot of you were wondering what I decided to do with the loops on this side of the build. As you can see, I've decided to use soft tube. The reason for that is, if I use the acrylic tube back here, I'd have to use a massive amount of it. I'd have to use a lot of fittings, and it would be weak. Over long distances, if you go straight from one fitting to the other with acrylic tube, the strength is still good. But if you have joins over long distances, and as you can see here, I have this big long piece of tube going right from the bottom of the build to the top, there would have been joins in that section if I made it from acrylic tube. And those joins really weaken the config. So what you end up having to do is reinforce it somehow. And the only way to reinforce it back here would have been to attach all of the acrylic tube to the case in multiple places. And you know, it is a big job, it's a big addition to the build, and it's really not worth it back here because it's completely out of sight. I definitely think that soft tubing back here is the way to go. I've now completed almost all of the custom cables. I still need to do the custom wiring for the fans, the pumps, and the lighting, but the bulk of it is certainly done. There is nearly 50 meters of wire and sleeving just in the cables that you can see here. So I've sleeved all of these cables in MDPC black heat shrinkless sleeving, and I've been through and started preparing these cables for installation. So I've started training them. I have put these clips on. Now these clips are made by ModSmart, and there's a clip design for 4 wires and another design for 3 wires, and these are awesome for custom cables. I've talked about them previously. They help hold the wires in position. Now this 24 pin, as you can see, there's a lot of crisscrossing of wires, and there's nothing you can do to avoid this. This is just because of the bad pinouts of power supplies. I really wish they would do something about this. Every power supply has just horrible pinouts. And this extra connector and 2 wires that you can see here, the 2 wires are actually spliced in to another 2 wires. They're soldered on, and this is for starting the second power supply. There's 2 power supplies in this build. When you hit the power button, it shorts a circuit that starts the power supply. And basically this extra connector and 2 wires shorts the same circuit in the second power supply, so they both start at the same time. Now I have 7 6-pin PCIe cables here. There's one here for the to give extra power to the PCIe slots on the Rampage 4 Extreme. I also have the 8-pin EPS, 4-pin ATX, and 24-pin. So I'm really happy with these cables. They've all been customized to length perfectly. I've been through and measured everything out. Most of them are made from the ground up. So the wires have been cut, the ends stripped, pins crimped on, sleeved, new connectors, everything from the ground up. So it is a massive amount of work. Okay, that sums up this part of the build log. I'm going to start the next part of the build log by installing all of the wiring. Then I'm going to move on to filling the loops. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.